Yeah.
Well, I was just saying, John and Jim were very, very important in the actual organization and running of the whole operation. And Father Eustace Hedon, who was then Professor of Education in UCG, he was sort of like the godfather. And and I think it was under his supervision that everything happened. But now I'm surmising all of that. I'm just not sure because that's the part of the background I was not personally involved in.
And Donald, do you remember roughly how many delegates were in Galway for that?
I would, if you judge by the numbers of papers presented, there were at least 18 people, but not all of the papers were reproduced in the proceedings. And as I recall, just, going back, looking over the crowd, I would say it was somewhere between 50 and 100, roughly. And there was a good representation from all of the island, north and south. And the keynote speaker was Sean O'Connor, who had just become chairman of the HEA at the time. He had been Secretary for Education for a number of years, and the conference took place just shortly after he had stepped down as secretary and became chairman of the HEA.
And was it from a sense of inspiration or enthusiasm, or was it from a sense of dissatisfaction, or was it from a mixture of both, perhaps, that the meeting
Yeah,
was convened?
Probably. As Eustace says in the introduction or the preface to the original proceedings, at the time of the conference, I had been writing to various departments of education around the country, north and south, to gauge whether there would be any interest in forming an organization. And my reason for doing that is I was a little bit concerned that there was very little interaction among education scholars at the time. So that would suggest to me that maybe the people organizing the conference were somewhat concerned as well that there wasn't any such organization. And so my answer to your question, Maureen, is that there must have been some general sense of dissatisfaction. And when I eventually proposed the idea of forming an organization, that got strong support, and everything took off from there.
Very interesting. So had you had the conversations with your colleagues in the University of Galway, or was it UCG at the time? I can't remember what it was
Well,
called.
this is the interesting thing, Maureen. I don't know if I knew anybody in the whole of Ireland outside of the few people in UCC that were in the Department of Education in UCC. Everybody was very, very isolated. There was no sense of community that I was aware of. And so that was a huge deficiency, I thought. And in addition to that, at that time, we're now talking about, the 1970s. At that time, education had not been highly supported within the colleges and universities. That would eventually change slowly, especially as departments of education began to become stronger and develop graduate programs that had not existed previously.
That's terrific, Donal. And it originally was a postgrad conference, wasn't it? The predominant focus of 1976 was for postgraduate students, north and south, wasn't it?
Again, now, Tony, that was probably the case, but not being involved in setting up that conference, I'm not really sure. But I'm not sure to what extent students were in attendance. I don't know that. There probably were in attendance because knowing Jim and John, they were the kind of people that wanted to get as many young people involved as possible.
Excellent.
And actually, it was there at that first conference that I met, people that I'd never seen before. And they would become, some of them would become very central to the development of the organization.
Fantastic. Going back, I'm just kind of following up on Tony's question there about, who was in attendance. So I know from looking at the proceedings that there were some teachers who presented, practicing
Okay.
teachers as opposed to, university lecturers. But
Yes.
I'm just wondering, would you feel, or have you a sense that maybe did any of Lawrence Stenhouse's work have any influence on thinking at the time, or was he just away in a different island altogether?
Well, I can't recall him becoming a particular voice as we began to get things moving. But then maybe Jim or John were more closely connected with his work. I think Jim, called on his work quite a bit at that time.
Okay, fair enough. That's great. And so UCG was the chosen venue, or the
Correct.
University of Galway was the chosen venue because that's
Yes.
where Jim was working and John.
Well, that's an interesting point. Jim, I think by the time of the conference, Jim had become a doctoral student at the new University of Ulster in Coleraine, because that's my recollection, and I think his paper to the conference associates him with the new University of Ulster. That can be checked easily enough, but I think that's the case. But he had been a graduate student at University College Galway, and Jim Marshall was still in Galway at that time, and of course Eustace Haydoin was the professor there. So it was very much, I think, set in motion by the people in Galway, plus Jim, who had just recently moved away from Galway.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, yeah.
Actually, Jim tells an amusing story about when he arrived in Coleraine. He was questioning the fee, that it shouldn't be quite so much. Oh, he said, "This is you're an overseas student." He said, "How could I be an overseas student? I came to Coleraine by bicycle," and and so Jim begins to assert his personality.
Very good. Yeah.
And Donal, and this is probably a tough one, but do you remember where on campus that first meeting was held? Was it in the equivalent in UCC of the Aula Maxima? Was it in the older part of the university, or do you recall, was it in another building location?
A tricky question. I do remember that Sean O'Connor gave a talk in a large room that seemed to combine the facility to have, maybe coffee and tea and that type of thing. But I can't say for sure what building it was. But my general recollection is that most of the proceedings occurred in the quadrangle area of the university.
Oh, excellent.
Mm.
So it probably was the Aula Maxima, or
It could have been, yes, it could have been.
very good.
Do you know, did the primary school curriculum came out in 1970? Did it have much bearing or, on teacher education at the time? Or, would you have any ideas around that, Donal?
I think people were very conscious of the fact that it had arrived, and but the university departments of education were essentially exclusively concerned with secondary teacher preparation. Uh, so it didn't impact me very heavily in my own teaching in UCC at the time. But there was a strong awareness, I think, among education scholars in general, of the significance of the new primary school curriculum.
Okay, fair enough.
And of course, it's just a decade after free secondary
That's
education.
correct.
So do you think
That's
it
right.
has an impact, because we can see that generationally, like the engagement now in higher education in Ireland is at record levels. We have amongst the highest per capita in the world. Do you think that
Okay.
the free secondary really started to mobilize a lot of change then, with more people going on into
Sure.
university and deciding to stay and pursue scholarship in education?
Sure. And I think around this time also, uh, the policymakers in Ireland and in the universities sort of, in my opinion, reluctantly began to become interested in supporting education as a subject of study in the universities, because it had been very largely, in my opinion, very largely neglected by the university institutions. And individuals like Val Rice in Trinity, and I know for a fact Alan McClellan in UCC, began to introduce the graduate programs, the master's degree programs, the MEd, I think, in most cases. And then that slowly got accepted, if you like, by the funding institutions and the universities themselves. And gradually we had almost all at the same time a gradual sort of resurgence in the study of education.
Fantastic. And was there a connection, say, with the British Education Research Association, or again, did you feel that sense of isolation, that this was the island of Ireland and that was the main focus?
All I can say about that is, as I recall, the early days, there wasn't much talk about those organizations outside the country. And certainly there wasn't much talk about the American Educational Studies Research Association. All of those things and all of those connections with ESAI came up much later.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose it was at the very beginning anyway, as you said, you felt isolated yourself in UCC,
Yes, correct.
so it was,
Absolutely. Yeah,
yeah,
very much so.
yeah, you had to take it step by step. So
And of
what,
course,
go on, Tony, sorry.
thanks, Maureen. And of course, Donal, it was really visionary to produce the proceedings. Maureen and I were looking at like some of the early proceedings where the fada had to be written in by hand. So
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
talking
yeah,
about a time when open
yeah.
publishing and desktop
That's right. Yeah.
was not non-existent. So the
Yes.
fact that the proceedings emerged was really remarkable and visionary of you to do that.
Well, the proceedings started right away, as you know, because the early one came out within 12 months, so that was published right away, and that set in motion the idea of having proceedings subsequently. And I remember the one in Cork in UCC. It was about triple the thickness of this. It was a massive tome, and and from there on, then the proceedings continued, and we used to have editorial meetings, and Jim was very important in the editorial meetings and the early production of proceedings, and then eventually it was decided we'd make a move to getting a better presentation of the actual proceedings, and then finally when Kieran Sugru became president several years later, maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years later, he had a strong connection with Taylor and Francis, and he was able to generate a connection with them that led to the current journal of the association.
And of course, you were there at the beginning. That photo, Donal, in your citation for your Lifetime Achievement Award, it's a wonderful photo of you with Professor John Coolan and the minister at the time, Minister Boland.
That,
And
that's
that
right, yes.
was then in
Yeah.
1981, wasn't it, that the journal was launched on its way? And of course, it's gone on to great things now, and in those years,
Yes.
but that
Yes.
was a remarkable step, I'm sure, to
It was a
keep the
big
journal.
step, and just as was the case at Galway, you had the chairman of the HEA, a very senior official in Irish education. He's present, and that's trying to, you know, establish a connection between education scholars and, significant leaders within the country. And then connecting with the ministers for education was another step in that direction.
So, Donal, can I think you've hit on a very pertinent point there. So, that whole notion of, say, ESAI as an association, and connecting up then and maybe having an influence on policy at the level of policy. So I'm hearing from you that way back in those early days, there definitely was a connection. And I would say maybe you felt that definitely ESAI would have influenced policy. Am I right?
Difficult to answer that, Maureen. Whether ESAI in the early days had an influence on policy making, I'm not so sure. But it was an objective of the association that we become closer to people who were involved in the policy making activities of the Department of Education. And so there was a very strong emphasis within the early years of two things: maintaining a connection with policymakers and emphasizing that this was a 32 county All Ireland association. And Jim McKernan was very, very strong on that dimension. And as you know, he has retained that commitment. And it was a very important aspiration of the association that should be the case.
And of course, it's so salient at the time, Donal, because Ireland was North and South was a different country at that time.
Yes, that's correct.
Very problematic and difficult time in our
That's
history.
correct. That's correct. Yeah.
Can you recall, and again, it might have been more to do with the people in Galway University at the time, but were people invited to the conference, or could people to the first meeting, or how were these people selected, or do you know?
I don't know. Short answer. All I know is that I was there.
That's good.
And
One good thing to know.
yeah, and there was at least one other person from UCC present. He was an elderly gentleman, very well known in Cork, and he had been a principal of a primary school for many, many years, and his name was Con Burns. He was there because I think we went together. Beyond that, I can't recall who else had come from Cork, but as I said earlier, there was, I would estimate, between at least 50 and 100 people at the conference. So they were coming from more than just UCC.
Yeah.
And Donal, like as well, was like, obviously it wasn't an email invitation you got, or
Well, that's a good point. And of course, the introduction of email, as you know better than I, that too has facilitated integration and communication across boundaries. But Maureen asked there, was it by invitation or was it not? And I can't remember how I came to go to the conference. It may have been an invitation to heads of departments, and heads of departments spread the word around departments, or it may have been a personal letter to myself, but I just can't recall that. And as you can see from the proceedings, I did not present a formally organized paper. And I'm sure if I had been asked, did I want to present a paper, I would have responded positively. So I didn't really have any knowledge of what was going on in the months before the actual conference itself.
and they were full papers, Donal. Was that what people read or presented?
Yeah, people read them in the same way that we do at the moment. And there was good discussion after the papers, as I recall. and good attendance at them. And it was very much as if it had been an ongoing operation, the way the conference actually proceeded itself.
And was it one day or was it over? Like we still have this, as you know, debate.
I think it was. I think it was as has remained the case. It was like a Thursday, Friday, Saturday event. You arrive on Thursday and you leave on Saturday. I think that was the format, and to my knowledge, that remains the format as well, or has been the case
Yes.
for many years.
And did you have a social program around the conference? Did you have a dinner or a tour or anything like that?
Yes, I think there was a meal at the beginning, and there was a hotel in Galway. I can't remember the name of it now, but I do remember the first night there was a good collection of people there, and I had got to know Sean O'Connor a little bit before that, but I remember having a good chat with him that night. And that's when I first met Johnny Coulahan, for example. And it was during the conference that I met Jim McKernan for the first time, that I had met John Marshall for the first time. Everything was for the first time, because as it sort of it sort of displays or shows the lack of communication that existed up to that point in time. And in that sense, it was a really, really important get together. It was a very important meeting.
So I'm kind of gathering from you that there was a huge sense of maybe conviviality, perhaps, or
Yeah, definitely, yes,
yeah, yeah,
definitely, yeah. Very congenial, very collegial, and to my knowledge, it's remained that way. You know,
yeah.
I've never seen ugly incidents that I've seen at other conferences where people have almost come to fisticuffs, but I've never seen anything like that at ESAI, and
Yeah.
that was present from the very beginning.
Yeah, that's really nice. Um, yeah, and I think it is something that has stayed with us over the 50 years, you know. I'm wondering, you know, at the time, so when we're putting in place our preparations for our conference,
Sure.
years to celebrate the 50 years since that initial meeting of scholars. And we're also talking about, imagining our future. You can see Tony's logo there, designing futures. It's something that's part of discourse and education at the moment. And I'm just wondering, at that meeting and when you all got together at the very beginning, not even necessarily for the meeting of scholars, but maybe in the years afterwards, were you envisioning a future, or could you foresee, or did you want to have particular things in place for a future?
That's a very interesting question. I sometimes ask myself that question. What I know is that when I made that little short presentation, and I think it was the last presentation of the conference, and it had not been part of the original schedule. There was a good attendance at that presentation, and there was a willingness to form a group of people, and a group of us, about I would say 6 or 7, decided that yes, we would form a sort of an organizational committee. And during the following 12 months, we had several meetings among ourselves, and we began to think of what this might become. Now, I have to say, back then, we were not wondering, like, would we be having this conversation 50 years later? There wasn't that sort of sharp awareness. But in my own mind, for sure, that was sort of the idea. We need to form an organization, get things going, and it will surely keep going if we get it started. That was sort of the sense. And I mean, the original executive committee, I mean, there was a very strong focus in making this a serious effort and a serious event. And things prospered almost beyond expectation, because at the time we got started, there were other scholarly associations like the Irish History Association, the Irish Historical Society, I think it was called, and the membership of ESAI, I think, probably far outnumbers the membership of some of those other organizations. And that's partly because there's a very strong sense of we need to have a core of education scholars who are sometimes teachers, sometimes school principals, as well as actual, university people, lecturers and professors and so forth. And I think that helped a lot in expanding the size of the association. And so in that sense, in terms both of numbers and representatives of various facets of education, the organization has really prospered, I believe. And we didn't foresee all of that at the beginning, but that's the way we were kind of working towards that without being fully aware of it.
Yes.
Brilliant. And Donal, who was on your committee to work with you on
Okay, I can remember several fairly clearly. Eustace O'Haydon remained the sort of the figurehead. He was like, we were like the youngsters and he was the adult in the room. I'm not sure if he attended all of the meetings, but the people who were very, very active were Jim McKernan, John Marshall, Johnny Coulahan. There was another lecturer in UCD, Sean O'Hagerty, who was a poet that's, whose poetry used to be on the school program for a number of years. There was obviously myself. And we had tried to get somebody from the various. There was another man from the Jordanstown, I think it was. I've forgotten his name, but he was very friendly with Jim McKernan, and it seemed to me that Jim and he had decided we will represent Northern Ireland. So there's I've mentioned about 6 or 7 people there. That was the core. And then at Cork, we established, up until Cork and up until the sort of the actual foundation of the conferences of the association itself, at that Cork meeting, we established a formal executive committee. Up till then, it was just a working committee. And Francis Douglas became a very important member. He became the sort of secretary treasurer of the organization, and he was very involved in actually expanding the membership and organizing the financial activities of the committee and of the association.
Brilliant. And Donal, just on the early conferences and in Galway as well, did you have parallel sessions, or was it a plenary where you had you'd sequentially paper after paper? How was
it was sequentially paper after paper, but I also think there were multiple papers at the same time.
Okay.
So the only plenaries that I remember were Sean O'Connor at the outset and my own little presentation at the very end. All of the others there were meetings running concurrently. That's my recollection.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about that futures thing. I'm just looking at your address, your informal address or your unplanned address to the meeting in 1976. And I think you say in it, that it would provide an opportunity for people to read and discuss their work with colleagues. And it would promote a greater degree of interaction on a yearly basis, at least, among people with common interest in education. And thirdly, it would find itself in a position to establish and support its own journal of educational studies. I mean, it's amazing how ESAI has, developed from that. This was nearly a wish paper that you had written, and that it's actually been realized and realized so fully. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, actually, I read that address before, as we began to correspond, Maureen, over the last few weeks. And yes, it's amazing that the things we were looking forward to have actually come to be. That it's quite remarkable. Yeah,
Oh my goodness, it's such an honor and a privilege to be able to chat to you, Donal, really, looking at our history over the 50 years. And I just look at Tony and myself here, and we're talking about the future as well of ESAI for our conference. And I,
sure,
I hope that our hopes will be only even a millionth realized, just as yours were at the time. It's phenomenal. And we're just honored to have you here, really.
sure. It's a pleasure. I love it. Yeah, and
Mm.
I can remember aspects of it vividly. And then, as you can see from what I'm saying, there are other parts of it that I knew little about.
Yeah. No, you've very clear recollection. It's fantastic. Yeah, an honor.
Absolutely. And just to echo what Maureen has said, and thanks so much, Donal. It's incredible, and
Sure.
everything you put in your position paper in 1976 has happened. It's a remarkable accomplishment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
I,
think that's been unreal, Donal. I mean, you've just the way you remember it all. But
Mm.
it obviously it was a very important moment in the history of education and educational scholarship in this country,
sure.
and it
Sure.
must
I
be,
agree. Yeah.
it must be hugely gratifying to you and to
Yes.
colleagues trying to see
Yes.
all your
Yes.
great
Yes.
groundbreaking work come to such
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah.
fruition. Um,
Donald, if we
Uh,
were to, first of all, before we do anything else, is there anything else you want to add to your recollections, or is there anything that we didn't tap into that you'd like to tell us about?
Um, other than the fact that, I mean, it's been a lifelong interest and very enjoyable. And even though I don't live in Ireland anymore, it's been easy to stay in touch, more or less. And I think the conviviality and the colleagueship of the association is one of the more, for me, one of the more impressive and enjoyable aspects of the whole thing.
Good, and I hope it continues to flourish in
Hopefully,
the same way.
yes,
Yes,
sure,
yeah, yeah.
sure.